this is a video to show you how to put spur overlays on. We're going to soft solder these 450 degree solder with Stay Bright flux, and I've done one spur there that I showed you, and I'm going to do the other one here. I'm going to get out these overlays, and what we're going to do is use this top flux and this top solder. This is the low temp, like I say, about 400, 450. Now you got to shape your overlays, and the best way to do that is to put them on the inside of the band of the spur, about where they're going to go, and that will shape them. I'm figuring out here exactly where I want this, and I see where I want it, and then I'm going to put it on the inside of the band, approximately the same location, and I'm going to bend it to the inside of the band, and this will kind of 90% form it to the shape I need, to where it'll sit flatter on the outside of the band. And this is the easiest way I've found to do it. And I'll make sure it fits down pretty tight, and you'll still have to do some clamping and several different things to get this flat. The idea with soldering is to make sure your overlays are sitting flat down on the band. You don't want no gaps. If you have gaps, it's going to be harder to solder. This is the shank filigree here, and it's got a little bit of curve in there to it, but I'm going to form it on the outside of the band, of course, or the outside of the shank, I mean. And I've got it about where I want it, and I'm just kind of bending it into the curve of this shank to band joint. These overlays have hard soldered brass centers in the flowers, so they won't come out when we do the soft solder. And then this is a brand I'm putting on these particular spurs, and it has to have a little curve on it too. Now the smaller your overlays, the harder it is to form a curve in them. I'm getting it formed here a little bit, but sometimes you have to take some pliers, some brass pliers or something, and put a little more persuasion into it to make it sit flat on the band. And that's what I'm going to do here. I've got my brass jaw pliers. I'm just putting a little more curve into the brand so it'll sit flatter. Because the smaller that brand is, you know, the tougher it is to bend it by hand like that. And it looks like it's going to fit okay that way. So what we're going to do next, I use a Weller soldering iron, and I'll show that to you here in a minute. I'm putting Stay Bright on the pieces. The two smaller pieces that I'm going to flux first, and I kind of run my solder off the coil up in the air so I can hit my gun on it. And I wear a mask when I'm using this top solder. It seems to put off a lot of smoke, and that smoke is very irritating to me. This I use a soldering pick too to hold the pieces in place. This is a Weller Industrial. It's a 300, 200 watt gun, and it'll melt that 400 degree solder real easily. Anyway, I got the light on it here, and it's heating up. Once it gets up to temperature, I just start putting some solder on the back of these pieces, and you can just pretty much brush it on there. Now the idea is to get you enough solder on these pieces to where when you heat them up on the band that they have plenty of solder to adhere to the band. If you see any bald spots in there, you know you need to get some solder on it, so go back and put some more on it. If you have some high points on these pieces, you can take your orbital and some sanding disc and just kind of knock it down a little bit. Some people do this with a torch. I just find it easier with my gun. And you can see the smoke that this type of solder puts off, and it kind of irritates me, so I always wear my mask. Now this is Silver Bright. It's a paste. It's low temp flux. I'm putting that on the shank because it sticks real good, and on the back of this overlay. And I'm going to do this shank filigree first. Now along the way I'll be using Stay Bright liquid flux, and what I mean along the way is if some of the flux is not there from the heat or whatever, I can always drip some more liquid onto the shank, and it'll go underneath the overlays and reflux it. I've got my stainless clips here. I'm putting this overlay into position. One of my other videos I showed how to make those clips. Now I start with a flame and I start heating below the shank a little bit and on the sides. You don't want to get it too hot. Now if you get your flux too hot, it'll turn dark brown, and if it turns black, it's way too hot. So and I get this one here a little too hot, and you'll see it here in just a moment. And if that happens, you can stop, cool it off, clean it up, reflux it, and go again. You can see the black there. So I know now that I've gotten it too hot and no flux is going to stick right there. Some of it did stick on the other parts of it, so it's held in place. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tap down some areas here, and then I'll cool it off, reflux it, and then I'll go at it again. And you just keep doing this. I'm going to add a little flux in. Sometimes when you tin it beforehand, if you don't see the solder exiting the edges, you need to add a little bit of solder into some places, because that means you didn't get quite enough, or it went to other areas that needed some solder. So you can just add a little bit to the outside edges, and that works real good too. And you can draw that solder around on that overlay with just the heat. I use a steel push rod in some areas to push it on down, and I use my hammer a lot to just tap it down. This filigree here has some real pointy leaves on it, and some of them points kind of stick up in places, so I tap them down. Anyway, when you get this soldered, you should see a little bit of solder showing along the outside edges of the filigree all the way around. And you can see here this one's soldered down, and we're going to flux this up here on the band, and we're going to get the larger piece put on here. You can see my stand I'm using here. It's got an earth magnet and a clamp welded to some bars. It's a pretty good holder for spurs. It gets them out in the open where you can put heat underneath them. And I think I've showed some more details on that on one of my spur videos that you might want to check out. Anyway, I'm getting it positioned here. I've got my overlay about where I want it. I've got several clamps holding it down. And when you're dealing with a long overlay like this, especially the filigree ones, you kind of have to start soldering down on one end and kind of work your way to the other end. You can't really solder the whole thing at once, even though it's tinned. I usually just start working on one end, and you can see there the solder just emerged from the overlay, so it means it's stuck down. And when you see that, and if it's all the way around, you can get your sponge, cool it off, and then reflux in another area and start heating up in another area like I'm doing here, and proceed on around the band. And that's what I'm doing here. I've got the front part of this filigree down under the swinger hanger, and I'm kind of tapping these petals down on this flower, and then I'm heating up underneath that middle part of the overlay. You want to make sure you always have enough flux on everything, and you saw me put some more on it there. The paste works good to start with, but the liquid works real good to add after the fact. And I'm trying to get that flower soldered down. Looks like I got it. I've got the brand on here now too, and I've got it clamped down, and it's a separate piece, but it's going right above this filigree bar. So you can see I'm going to take it off of here. I'm going to cool it off, clean it up a little bit, and I'm going to solder the brand here now. It's right up there about the middle of the band. And I just do the same thing. I start heating it up underneath the band. You can see the flux bubbling up there some, and you just don't want to get too hot. I'm pushing down on the brand with the push rod and holding it down until the solder starts flowing. When it flows, it kind of pops a little bit and sets down on the band. And then I just cool it off, and I'm ready to go to another area. Anyway, this one's coming along real well. Looks like I got one more area here to tap down. Some of these flowers are sticking up a little bit, so don't want that. Don't be afraid to tap them a little bit. You can, it'll all sand out in the end. These particular filigrees are going to be all engraved also. Anyway, I proceed on with the flux in it and heating it up and adding a little solder here and there if the tinning is not sufficient. It's rarely that I don't have to add a little bit more solder on it on a big filigree like this. Now here I put it down in my lava rock. I took it off the spur stand. It was just easier for me to get to this area up by the shank. And I'm heating it up right there in the top of that scroll. There's a little area there that don't have much solder, and I want to add it right here at the top of this flower. And as long as you got it fluxed good and the heat's right, it'll suck it right under there. And then cool it off, and I think I got this one whipped. We'll look at it here, dry it off here, and let you see. And you want to inspect it real good. If you got even one little flower that's not soldered down, you need to go back, flux, and solder that flower. Anyway, this one looks real good to me. It's, of course, needs to be all cleaned up, and that's what we're going to go show you next out at my other shop. Okay, we're at my other shop. I've got my sand bead blaster kit here, or cabinet here, and I open the side door. I'm going to put my spurs in here. I've got a gun with this. You know, most of you are familiar with these. And this is some real fine bead blasting material that I use. It doesn't hurt the silver, but it does take off the solder, especially the low temp solder. The higher temp solders, it'll take it off, but you got to really work at it. And you can see me here, I'm spraying it down. I go over every inch of this overlay, and I make sure I get all the solder out between the flowers that's run out. It's not, you know, out on the band that's not supposed to be there. And this eliminates having to go through and trying to polish all that stuff out. Okay, and I did the whole spur to make the sheen look the same. There's one area here I taped a little bit because I didn't want it to blast that area. But I'm looking it over here, and this one looks really good. It looks like I got all the solder out of the area. I know you can't see it too good because of the light, but I'll show you another picture here. There you go. You can see how clean everything is now. Okay, this is a 3M 7S fine deburring wheel. This one's getting pretty small. I've had it for quite a couple of years. They don't wear down very fast, but anyway, it'll really shine this spur up. It takes off the bead blasting scratches, and I go over all of the band. I go over the overlays. It makes the overlays shine good. And I'll show you here when I get finished with it. You can see how it did this band here. And now I'm gonna buff this overlay side. Sometimes it's a little tough to get up around the hangers and into the curve of the shanks and things like that, but for the most part it works really well. And you can see here I'm getting this overlay pretty good, trying to get it down to the steel also, between the overlay flowers and all that. And I go over the rowel points, and there you go. It's pretty nice. And of course we'll polish it further later on. We have to engrave this whole thing. Okay, now we're going to clean up the inside of the band, because from the soldering and all, even though we cleaned this up earlier, from the soldering and all, it's turned black and got flux on it and things like that. So I'm using a 400 grit belt here on my belt sander, and I'm just kind of running it back and forth around the inside of the band. And then I'm also putting a little bit of a bevel on the edges. You can see how it cleaned the band up real nice. The whole spur is looking pretty good. And there's the finished product. So I hope you learned something from this video, and stay tuned. We'll get some more videos out to you.